In this episode, we are going to talk about a kind of risk that feels a little sneaky at first because it involves people intentionally trying to make an AI system behave badly. When you are brand new to cybersecurity, it is easy to assume the biggest danger is someone breaking into a server, but many AI failures happen because an attacker or a mischievous user simply talks to the system in a way that tricks it. Adversarial inputs are inputs designed to bypass safety, confuse the model, or cause harmful outputs, and they matter because AI systems are built to be responsive and helpful, which can be exploited. We will focus on three core ideas that appear repeatedly in real-world risk management: evasion, prompt injection, and abuse patterns. Evasion is about slipping past filters and controls. Prompt injection is about smuggling instructions that override intended behavior. And abuse patterns are the repeated strategies attackers use once they learn what works. By the end, you should understand why these threats are normal to expect and how a responsible program designs defenses without relying on perfect users. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is to understand why adversarial inputs exist in the first place, because beginners sometimes imagine attackers as people who only care about stealing data. Many adversarial inputs are about influence and control, meaning the attacker wants the system to say something harmful, reveal something it should not, or take an action it should not take. Sometimes the goal is to cause embarrassment, sometimes it is to generate disinformation, and sometimes it is to create a path to deeper compromise by tricking the system into exposing secrets or bypassing permissions. The important lesson is that the input is the attack surface, and that attack surface is large because language is flexible. Traditional systems often accept structured inputs with strict formats, while AI systems often accept free-form text, images, or other content that is hard to validate perfectly. Adversarial thinking means you assume someone will try weird phrasing, indirect requests, and manipulative framing until the system slips. This is not pessimism. It is the same mindset cybersecurity uses everywhere else. If a boundary exists, someone will probe it. Once you accept that, you can design controls that expect pressure. Evasion is one of the most common adversarial strategies, and it is easiest to grasp if you think of it as an attacker trying to hide a bad request inside something that looks harmless. An evasion attempt might try to rephrase a prohibited request in a roundabout way, or it might break up words, use slang, use spelling tricks, or bury the request in a long story so that detection is harder. The attacker's goal is not necessarily to be clever in a technical sense, but to find a path around the rules the system is supposed to follow. Beginners sometimes think filters are simple keyword blocks, so evasion is solved by adding more keywords, but real evasion is about meaning, not just exact words. A model can be tricked into producing unsafe content if it does not recognize the intent behind the phrasing, or if it tries too hard to be helpful and fill in missing details. Evasion is also about context, because the same words can be safe in one context and harmful in another, and attackers exploit that ambiguity. Protecting against evasion means you test how the system behaves with disguised intent, and you build layered controls that do not rely on a single detection method. Another reason evasion matters is that it can cause harm even when the system never touches sensitive data or external systems. If an AI assistant is used internally, evasion can produce toxic or discriminatory language that harms employees and damages culture. If the system is customer-facing, evasion can produce misleading claims, unsafe advice, or policy violations that create legal and reputational risk. If the system generates recommendations, evasion can manipulate the model into encouraging risky actions, especially when the user frames the request as hypothetical or educational. Beginners often assume a system is safe because it has a policy, but evasion attacks target the gap between policy and behavior. A responsible approach treats evasion like a routine quality challenge and builds test cases that reflect the real creativity of attackers. This connects to lifecycle controls because evasion success can increase when the system is updated, tuned, or connected to new content sources. If you do not retest, you can accidentally weaken your defenses without noticing. Evasion defense is therefore not a one-time feature. It is an ongoing discipline that stays aligned with how attackers adapt. Prompt injection is a more specific adversarial strategy, and it becomes especially important when AI systems can retrieve information, call tools, or interact with other components. Prompt injection is when an attacker places hidden or manipulative instructions into content that the model will read, causing it to follow the attacker's instructions instead of the system's intended rules. This can happen in obvious ways, like a user directly telling the model to ignore safety rules, but the more dangerous forms are indirect. For example, the attacker might embed instructions inside a document, a web page, a message, or any content the model is asked to summarize or use as context. The model may treat that content as authoritative and comply because its job is to use provided context. Beginners sometimes misunderstand this and think the model can simply be told to not follow bad instructions. But the challenge is that the system must decide what content is data and what content is instruction. Prompt injection is essentially a confusion attack against that boundary. Protecting against it requires disciplined separation of roles, meaning the system must treat external content as untrusted and must not allow it to rewrite system behavior. Prompt injection becomes more serious when the model has access to sensitive information or capabilities, because the attacker can try to trick it into revealing data or performing actions beyond what the user should be allowed to do. Even if the model cannot directly execute commands, it can still be manipulated into exposing internal policies, internal summaries, or confidential snippets that were retrieved for context. Another risk is that the model might be tricked into producing outputs that look like legitimate instructions for humans, and those humans may follow them, creating a human-in-the-loop attack path. Beginners often assume that because the attacker cannot log in, they cannot cause meaningful damage, but prompt injection targets the model's role as a trusted intermediary. If the model is the interface that sees documents and responds in natural language, then controlling the model's behavior becomes a powerful lever. This is why permissions and least privilege matter, and why models should not be given broad access to content they do not need. Protecting against prompt injection includes designing strict boundaries on what the model can access and designing outputs so that untrusted content cannot quietly become a hidden instruction channel. When the system treats all external content as potentially hostile, it behaves more like a secure parser than a naive assistant. A key part of defending against prompt injection is building the right mental model for what counts as trusted instruction. Trusted instruction should come from the system's own configuration and from authorized workflows, not from whatever text happens to be present in user content. Untrusted content should be treated as data to analyze, not as commands to follow, even if the content is phrased like an instruction. For beginners, it helps to think of this like social engineering, where an attacker uses persuasive language to get a person to ignore procedures. Prompt injection is social engineering for the model. The defense is similar: clear rules about authority, clear separation of roles, and consistent refusal when someone without authority asks for restricted actions. Another important idea is that injection defenses should focus on outcomes, not just on detecting the phrase "ignore previous instructions." Attackers will not use the obvious phrase once it stops working. What matters is whether the system can be manipulated into revealing protected data, bypassing safety constraints, or taking actions outside its scope. When defenses are built around protecting boundaries, they remain useful even as attacker wording evolves. Abuse patterns are the third concept, and they are what you get when you stop thinking of attacks as isolated clever tricks and start thinking of them as repeated behaviors that can be recognized. Attackers rarely invent entirely new methods every time. They reuse what works, and they iterate when defenses block them. Abuse patterns can include repeated probing of policy boundaries, repeated attempts to get restricted content through paraphrasing, repeated attempts to cause harmful outputs that can be shared publicly, and repeated attempts to extract sensitive details by asking many small questions. Another pattern is role-play framing, where the attacker asks the model to pretend or simulate in order to bypass restrictions. Another pattern is context flooding, where the attacker provides excessive text to distract controls and hide malicious intent. Beginners sometimes think abuse is obvious, but many patterns look like normal use until you see repetition and intent. This is why monitoring is so important. You cannot defend against patterns you never observe. When you learn to recognize patterns, you can build controls that target behavior rather than specific words. Understanding abuse patterns also helps you avoid a beginner trap, which is thinking that a single safe response means the system is secure. Attackers often succeed through persistence, not through one perfect prompt, and they will try many small variations until they find a weak spot. A system that refuses 9 times and fails on the 10th is still vulnerable, especially if the failure reveals something sensitive. Another trap is thinking the attacker is always an outsider, when in reality insiders, testers, and curious users can also engage in abuse, sometimes without malicious intent. That still matters because harm can occur regardless of intent, and once a technique spreads, it can be reused widely. Abuse patterns also interact with business incentives, because systems that are optimized for user satisfaction may be more likely to bend rules in order to appear helpful. That is why governance must define boundaries that the system cannot cross, even when users are demanding. A practical defense mindset is to treat abuse like a certainty, not a possibility, and to build your system so that repeated probing becomes less effective over time. When you build with that expectation, you reduce the chance of being surprised. Defenses against adversarial inputs work best when they are layered, because any single control can be bypassed, misconfigured, or weakened by updates. A layer can be a boundary on what the model is allowed to do, a boundary on what data it can access, a boundary on what outputs are allowed, and a boundary on how high-impact actions are handled. For example, if the model can produce text that influences decisions, you might require human review for certain categories of output so that the model cannot directly trigger harm. If the model can retrieve documents, you might limit retrieval to content that is authorized for the user and relevant to the task, reducing the chance of accidental exposure. If the system logs interactions, you might minimize sensitive data retention so that even if an attacker extracts something, there is less to extract. Beginners sometimes want one magic safeguard, but layered defenses are the standard cybersecurity approach because they reduce single points of failure. The key is that each layer should protect a different boundary, so that bypassing one does not automatically bypass all. When defenses are layered thoughtfully, attackers have to overcome multiple obstacles, which reduces risk and increases detection opportunities. Testing is a critical part of protection because you cannot trust defenses you have never challenged. Adversarial testing means you intentionally try to break the system using evasion and injection techniques. Then you document what happened and improve the controls. This kind of testing should not be limited to a few obvious prompts, because obvious prompts are the first thing attackers will move beyond. Instead, testing should include variations in phrasing, context, and user intent, including prompts that resemble real user behavior under stress. It should also include tests against retrieved content, because prompt injection often arrives indirectly through documents and messages. Another important testing concept is regression, meaning you rerun key adversarial tests after updates to make sure defenses did not degrade. Beginners often assume updates only improve systems, but updates can create new behaviors that weaken safety. When you treat adversarial testing as part of change management, you keep your defenses aligned with the system's evolution. This is also where evidence matters, because you need records of what was tested and what the outcomes were to prove that protection is real. Monitoring and response complete the picture, because even well-tested systems will face novel attacks in production. Monitoring helps you detect patterns like repeated probing, unusual spikes in certain types of requests, or clusters of refusals followed by a suspicious success. It also helps you detect when the system starts producing outputs that violate policy, even if the input did not look obviously malicious. Response planning matters because once you detect abuse, you need a way to contain it, communicate internally, and fix the weakness without causing new harm. Containment might mean limiting certain capabilities temporarily, increasing review thresholds, or restricting access for suspected abuse while preserving legitimate use. Beginners sometimes think response is only for breaches, but adversarial input incidents can be safety incidents, privacy incidents, or trust incidents, and they deserve the same disciplined handling. Another key point is learning. Every confirmed abuse pattern should feed back into testing and training so the system becomes more resilient. When monitoring is connected to improvement, adversaries find it harder to reuse the same trick repeatedly. That is how you move from reactive defense to adaptive defense. It is also important to understand the human factors that make adversarial inputs more dangerous, because attackers often rely on predictable human behavior around AI. Users may assume the system is safe because it is provided by the organization, and that assumption can cause them to trust outputs too quickly. Users may also share system outputs externally without context, which can amplify harm if the output is toxic or misleading. Builders and product teams may prioritize smooth experiences and reduce friction, which can weaken boundaries that would otherwise slow attackers down. Another human factor is that people often treat the model like a person, and they may be persuaded by confident language even when the content is unsafe. A good defense strategy, therefore, includes user education about safe use and includes interface cues that discourage blind trust. This is not about blaming users. It is about designing systems that work in the real world where users are busy and imperfect. When you consider human factors, you build protections that do not rely on perfect judgment in every interaction. That is exactly how cybersecurity defenses succeed more broadly. They assume humans will make mistakes, and they plan for it. As we close, protecting against adversarial inputs is about accepting that AI systems will be tested by people who want to bypass boundaries, then designing controls that keep those boundaries firm. Evasion attacks try to sneak harmful intent past filters through wording tricks and ambiguity. Prompt injection attacks try to smuggle instructions into content so the model follows the wrong authority, and abuse patterns describe the repeated strategies attackers use to probe and exploit weaknesses over time. Strong protection relies on layered defenses that separate trusted instructions from untrusted content, limit access and capabilities to what is necessary, and ensure high-impact outcomes are constrained and reviewable. It also relies on adversarial testing that pressures the system in realistic ways and on monitoring that recognizes patterns rather than waiting for a single dramatic failure. Most importantly, protection is a life cycle discipline. As the system updates and expands, defenses must be retested, evidence must be maintained, and lessons must feed back into improvement. For a brand new learner, the key takeaway is that adversarial inputs are not an edge case. They are a normal condition of deploying AI, and planning for them is how you keep helpful systems from becoming easy targets.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.